The siren started at 6:47 a.m., cutting through the morning calm like a blade through silk. Commander Sarah Chin stood at the observation deck of Fort Mitchell, watching the smoke plumes rise from the city skyline 12 miles away, each black column marking another neighborhood consumed by chaos. The radio crackled with desperate voices, police dispatchers overwhelmed, military units going silent one by one, and beneath it all, the sounds that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Screaming, gunfire, and something else, something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. Her weathered hands gripped the railing as Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez burst through the door behind her, his usually composed demeanor shattered. "Ma'am, we've got a problem," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Chicago's gone dark. So is Detroit. And now we're getting reports from Houston and Phoenix." Sarah's blood ran cold as she turned to face him, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. "How many cities?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would change everything. 17 confirmed, ma'am. All major population centers hit simultaneously at dawn. The implications crashed over her like a tsunami. This wasn't random, wasn't some natural disaster or isolated outbreak. Someone had orchestrated this, planned it, executed it with military precision. As if summoned by her thoughts, Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared at the doorway, her lab coat stained with coffee and exhaustion, clutching a tablet that displayed data she'd been analyzing since the first reports came in. "Commander, I've been studying the transmission patterns," she said, her accent thick with urgency. "This isn't following any known epidemiological model. The infection vectors are too coordinated, too synchronized. Someone weaponized this." Sarah nodded grimly, her mind already shifting into crisis mode, cataloging resources, calculating odds, preparing for the impossible. The base had been designed to withstand conventional warfare, but what was approaching their gates defied every tactical manual ever written. The first refugees had arrived an hour ago, a family of 4 in a bullet-riddled sedan, the father's arm wrapped in a blood-soaked towel, the mother clutching 2 small children who couldn't stop crying. They spoke of neighbors turning into monsters, of streets filled with bodies that wouldn't stay dead, of a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. Now, as the sun climbed higher, more vehicles appeared on the horizon, some moving fast, others crawling, all carrying the same desperate cargo of human survival. The outer perimeter guards reported strange readings on their thermal sensors, massive heat signatures moving through the forest, but when they looked through their scopes they saw nothing but empty trees. Rodriguez coordinated the defense preparations with mechanical efficiency, his 20 years of military service kicking in despite the surreal nature of their situation. Barricades went up, ammunition was distributed, and evacuation protocols were established, though where they could evacuate to remained a haunting question. Dr. Vasquez worked frantically in her makeshift laboratory, analyzing blood samples from the refugees, trying to understand the biological impossibility of what they were facing. The virus, if it was a virus, seemed to rewrite fundamental cellular processes, creating a hybrid state between life and death that challenged every scientific principle she'd ever learned. As evening approached, the temperature dropped, and with it came sounds that made hardened soldiers check their weapons twice. Moaning carried on the wind, not human but not quite animal either, accompanied by the rustle of movement through the underbrush. The base's floodlights illuminated the treeline, revealing nothing but shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. Sarah gathered her core team in the command center, studying maps and radio reports, trying to piece together a strategy for the unthinkable. The CDC had gone silent, FEMA was overwhelmed, and the president's last transmission had been a simple message: "God help us all." The refugee count had reached 47 people, ranging from infants to elderly, all looking to the military for salvation that Sarah wasn't sure she could provide. As midnight approached, the motion sensors along the perimeter began triggering in sequence, creating a pattern that suggested coordinated movement. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom. "Commander, we've got multiple contacts approaching from all directions. They're not trying to hide anymore." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that whatever emerged from those shadows would determine not just their survival, but the fate of humanity itself. The first wave had begun and there was no turning back. 3 days had passed since the first wave, and Fort Mitchell had become a fortress of whispered prayers and dwindling hope. Commander Sarah Chin descended into the underground bunker system, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls that now felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows that made everyone jump at phantoms, their nerves frayed beyond repair. 63 refugees now crowded the facility designed for 30, and the air grew thicker with each passing hour, heavy with fear and the metallic scent of recycled oxygen. Dr. Elena Vasquez had barely slept, her eyes bloodshot from staring at microscope slides and computer screens, trying to decode the impossible organism that had turned their world upside down. "Sarah, you need to see this," she called out, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and discovery. The commander approached the makeshift laboratory, where Elena had spread classified documents across every available surface, their red top-secret stamps glowing under the harsh lights. "I've been comparing the viral structure to everything in the government databases," Elena continued, pointing to a series of genetic sequences displayed on her laptop. "This isn't natural evolution, it's engineered, and I recognize the signature." Sarah's blood ran cold as she studied the data, seeing patterns that spoke of human intervention, of science pushed beyond ethical boundaries. Someone created this intentionally? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, changing everything they thought they knew about their situation. Before Elena could respond, the bunker's main door burst open with a screech of grinding metal, and Sergeant Rodriguez appeared, escorting a newcomer who looked like he'd crawled through hell itself. Jake Morrison was a thin man in his 40s, his CDC jacket torn and stained with substances Sarah didn't want to identify, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if expecting attack from every shadow. "Commander Chin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you immediately. I have information about what's happening up there, but it's not what you think." Sarah gestured for him to continue, noticing how the other survivors instinctively moved away from the newcomer, their survival instincts screaming warnings about trusting strangers in this new world. Jake pulled out a waterproof case from his jacket, revealing documents that made Elena's classified files look like grocery lists. "There are safe zones," he said, spreading out maps marked with red circles and green squares. "Military installations that were prepared for this scenario, underground facilities with enough supplies for years, but they're not taking everyone." His fingers traced routes across the country, showing pathways between fortified locations that formed a network of survival. "The government knew this was coming?" Sarah asked, though the answer was written across Jake's haunted expression. "Some did. Others were kept in the dark until it was too late. The bioweapons program was supposed to be dormant, but someone reactivated it, weaponized it, and released it simultaneously across multiple cities." Elena stepped forward, her scientific mind racing with implications. The coordination, the timing, this required inside knowledge, access to distribution networks, and a complete understanding of the viral mechanisms. Jake nodded grimly, then delivered the news that would change their entire strategy. "The infected aren't just random anymore. They're learning, adapting, forming groups. I've seen them use tools, coordinate attacks, even retain fragments of their former memories." As if summoned by his words, the base's alarm system began shrieking, red lights bathing the bunker in an apocalyptic glow. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom, "Commander, we've got a problem. The infected have surrounded the base, but they're not attacking. They're just waiting." Sarah rushed to the surveillance monitors, seeing dozens of figures standing motionless in the darkness beyond the perimeter, their eyes reflecting the floodlights like stars in the void. Among them she recognized faces, former neighbors, local shopkeepers, a mail carrier who had delivered packages to the base for years. But something was different about their posture, their organization, as if they were soldiers awaiting orders rather than mindless predators. Dr. Vasquez joined her at the monitors, her scientific fascination warring with pure terror. "They're coordinating," she whispered. "This isn't random behavior, they're planning something." Jake Morrison stood behind them, his expression grave with knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "There's something else," he said, his voice cutting through the alarm's wail. "The virus has multiple variants. Some create the mindless infected we've seen, but others create something much more dangerous. Leaders. Commanders. The kind that can think, plan, and organize the others." Sarah felt the weight of command crushing down on her shoulders as she realized their situation had just become infinitely more complex. The base's defenses were designed to repel human attackers, not an army of the undead led by infected individuals who retain tactical knowledge. "How long do we have?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would shatter what little hope they had left. Jake checked his watch, his face pale in the monitor's glow. "Based on the patterns I've observed, they'll attack just before dawn. That gives us maybe 4 hours to decide, fight and probably die, or abandon everything and run toward an uncertain salvation." The weight of 63 lives pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as she stared at the organized army of the dead, knowing that whatever decision she made in the next few minutes would determine who lived to see another sunset in this new, impossible world. The evacuation began at 4:17 a.m., 1 week after the world ended, with Commander Sarah Chen making the hardest decision of her military career. The base's emergency tunnels hadn't been used since the Cold War, but they provided the only escape route that wouldn't lead directly into the waiting arms of the organized infected army. 63 survivors moved through the darkness like ghosts, carrying everything they could manage in backpacks and duffel bags, leaving behind the illusion of safety for the terrifying uncertainty of the open road. The convoy that emerged from the tunnel system 2 miles from the base consisted of 7 vehicles: military trucks, civilian cars, and a converted school bus that had become their mobile command center. Jake Morrison rode in the lead vehicle with Sarah, his maps spread across the dashboard, marking safe zones and danger areas with the precision of someone who had witnessed the apocalypse unfold from the inside. Behind them, Dr. Elena Vasquez tended to the wounded in the medical truck, her portable laboratory secured in waterproof cases, the viral samples that might hold the key to humanity's survival traveling alongside crying children and traumatized adults. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of broken dreams, littered with abandoned vehicles and the remnants of failed escape attempts. Every few miles they encountered other survivor groups. Some waved desperately for help, others pointed weapons at the approaching convoy, and a few simply stared with the hollow eyes of those who had lost everything worth living for. Sarah established protocols for these encounters, knowing that every decision to stop or keep moving carried life or death consequences for everyone under her protection. 20 miles from the base they met the Torres twins, Alex and Sam, 2 mechanics who had converted their garage into a mobile repair station, their pickup truck loaded with tools and spare parts that would prove invaluable in the days to come. The brothers had been traveling the highways, helping other survivors keep their vehicles running, trading mechanical expertise for food and fuel. Their knowledge of back roads and hidden gas stations became crucial as the convoy navigated around major cities where the infected concentrated in massive hordes. 50 miles further north, they encountered Henry and Ruth Palmer, an elderly couple whose RV had broken down beside a burned-out gas station. The decision to help them sparked the convoy's first major conflict, with several survivors arguing that the elderly would slow them down, that resources were too precious to waste on those who might not survive the journey anyway. Sarah watched the group fracture along moral lines, some clinging to their humanity while others embraced the brutal calculus of survival. The argument ended when infected emerged from the gas station, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and Henry Palmer proved his worth by taking down 3 of them with a hunting rifle, his steady hands and sharp eyes making him a valuable asset despite his age. As they pushed deeper into the wasteland that had once been America, the convoy's radio picked up transmissions from other survivor groups, painting a picture of a world where isolated pockets of humanity struggled against an ever-growing tide of the undead. Some groups had established fortified settlements, others roamed like nomads, and a few had turned to raiding weaker survivors for supplies. The safe zone Jake had promised lay 200 miles north, but the journey was becoming more treacherous with each passing mile, as fuel grew scarce and the infected grew bolder. The convoy's worst nightmare materialized on day 3 of their journey, when they crested a hill and saw the highway ahead packed with thousands of infected, a migrating horde that stretched from horizon to horizon. Sarah made the decision to leave the main road, leading the convoy through smaller towns and rural areas where the infected were fewer but the terrain was more challenging. They lost their first vehicle to a broken axle, forcing difficult decisions about who would ride and who would walk, testing the fragile bonds that held their group together. The breaking point came when they reached the abandoned Millfield Shopping Center, a sprawling complex that offered both shelter and supplies, but also represented everything they had lost. The decision to stop and resupply became a desperate last stand when a massive horde surrounded the complex, drawn by the noise of their vehicles and the scent of living flesh. Sarah stood at the mall's main entrance, watching hundreds of infected press against the glass doors, their dead eyes reflecting the emergency lighting as her people barricaded themselves inside what might become their tomb. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had fled one fortress only to find themselves trapped in another, with even fewer options and dwindling hope. As the infected began to organize themselves outside, forming coordinated groups that tested different entrances, Sarah realized that their journey north had become a race against time, and the finish line was starting to look more like a cliff edge than a safe haven. The Millfield Shopping Center had become their prison of chrome and marble, 2 weeks into what the survivors had started calling the New World, though nothing about it felt remotely new, only ancient, primal, and utterly terrifying. Commander Sarah Chin stood in the abandoned radio shack, now converted into their communications hub, watching the infected mass outside the main entrance through security monitors that flickered with static interference. The horde had grown to nearly 1,000, their movements synchronized in ways that defied everything she thought she knew about mindless creatures. Maria Santos, the former mall security guard who had been trapped inside when the outbreak began, proved invaluable with her knowledge of the building's layout, leading them through service corridors and maintenance areas that became their lifelines. Her keys opened storage rooms filled with supplies that the panicked shoppers had missed during the initial chaos, but even these resources were finite, and the mathematics of survival were unforgiving. 67 people consuming food and water faster than they could stretch their reserves. The mall's central court had become their communal area, where teenage siblings David and Lisa Chin, no relation to Sarah, helped maintain morale by organizing activities for the younger children, though their efforts couldn't mask the growing tension between different survivor factions. Dr. Elena Vasquez had established her laboratory in the former Victoria's Secret, the irony not lost on anyone as she worked surrounded by abandoned lingerie displays, her microscopes and centrifuges powered by the mall's emergency generators that burned through their fuel supply with mechanical indifference. Her latest discoveries were more disturbing than anything they had faced before. The virus had multiple variants, each designed for different purposes, and some of the infected outside retained fragments of their former memories, making them far more dangerous than simple predators. The first major conflict erupted on day 4 when two separate groups of survivors, led by different philosophies of leadership, clashed over resource allocation and decision-making authority. Jake Morrison advocated for immediate evacuation, insisting that staying put was suicide, while Henry Palmer argued for fortifying their position and waiting for military rescue that might never come. The argument turned physical when someone suggested leaving the weaker members behind, and Sarah found herself breaking up fights between people who should have been united against their common enemy. The mall's glass walls, which had once showcased consumer paradise, now offered a terrifying view of the organized infected who moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, and worst of all, patience. Some of the creatures stood motionless for hours, their dead eyes fixed on specific points within the mall, as if they were studying the survivors' routines and looking for weaknesses. Others moved in coordinated groups, testing different entrances and exits, probing for vulnerabilities with the methodical precision of military tacticians. Maria Santos discovered that the mall's old emergency broadcast system still functioned, allowing them to pick up transmissions from other survivor groups across the region, painting a picture of isolated communities struggling against impossible odds. The messages were fragmentary and often cut short by screams or gunfire, but they revealed that the infection had spread globally, that governments had collapsed, and that the safe zones Jake had promised might be myths created by desperate people clinging to false hope. Dr. Vasquez's research took a terrifying turn when she began studying blood samples from some of the infected they had captured, discovering that the virus could remain dormant in living hosts for extended periods before activation. The implications were staggering. Anyone among them could be carrying the infection, waiting to transform at the worst possible moment. This revelation created a new layer of paranoia within the group, as people began eyeing each other with suspicion, wondering who might be the next to turn. The teenagers David and Lisa Chin proved surprisingly resilient, using their knowledge of video games and horror movies to suggest defensive strategies that adults had overlooked, their generation's familiarity with apocalyptic scenarios providing unexpected insights into survival tactics. Their youth gave them an adaptability that older survivors struggled to match, and they quickly became valuable members of the defensive planning committee. The breaking point came when the infected began their coordinated assault, not with mindless rushing but with tactical precision that spoke of retained military or police training among their ranks. They attacked multiple entrances simultaneously, using tools and weapons they had scavenged, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that shattered every assumption about undead behavior. Sarah watched in horror as some infected used shopping carts as battering rams while others climbed onto the roof, their movements coordinated by what appeared to be infected individuals who stood back from the assault, observing and directing like generals commanding an army. The mall's defenses, hastily constructed from furniture and shopping fixtures, began to fail under the systematic assault, and Sarah realized that their fortress of glass was about to become their tomb unless they could find a way to turn the infected's intelligence against them, using their own tactical thinking to outwit creatures that should have been nothing more than mindless predators driven by hunger. The escape from Millfield Shopping Center had cost them everything: vehicles, supplies, and most heartbreakingly, 12 members of their group who didn't make it through the coordinated infected assault. Commander Sarah Chun led the remaining 55 survivors through the pre-dawn darkness, following deer trails and forgotten farm roads that snaked through the rural countryside, their footsteps muffled by morning dew and the weight of loss. 3 weeks into their nightmare journey, they had learned to move like ghosts, communicating through hand signals and staying off main roads where both infected hordes and something far worse roamed freely. The Bradley Ranch appeared through the morning mist like a mirage of hope, its weathered barn and farmhouse surrounded by reinforced fencing that spoke of preparation and forethought. Tom Bradley emerged from the main house carrying a shotgun, his weathered face showing the kind of wariness that had kept him alive when so many others had fallen, but his eyes softened when he saw the children among the survivors, and his daughter Emma stepped out behind him, her rifle lowered but ready. The ranch had been fortified since the early days of the outbreak, with Emma's expertise as a tracker and her father's knowledge of the land creating a sanctuary that had successfully repelled multiple infected attacks. Emma Bradley proved to be a revelation. Barely 25, she moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who had spent her life reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed soil, her ability to track both infected and human threats making her invaluable to the group's survival. Dr. Elena Vasquez established her laboratory in the ranch's storm cellar, finally able to work with proper equipment that Tom had salvaged from a nearby veterinary clinic, her research taking a promising turn as she discovered that the virus could be slowed, though not stopped, by certain compounds found in common antibiotics. The breakthrough came when she realized that the infection's progression could be delayed by up to 72 hours, giving potential victims time to reach help or say goodbye to their loved ones, a small mercy in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The illusion of safety shattered on their fourth night at the ranch when Emma's early warning system, a network of motion sensors and tripwires she had established throughout the property, detected multiple human contacts approaching from 3 different directions. These weren't infected, whose movements Emma had learned to distinguish from the living, but coordinated human assault teams moving with military precision through the darkness. The Hunters, as they called themselves, had emerged from the chaos of the New World as a militaristic group that viewed other survivors as competition for limited resources, their philosophy twisted by desperation into something that resembled organized banditry more than survival strategy. Their leader, a former army sergeant named Marcus Steele, had convinced his followers that mercy was a luxury humanity could no longer afford, that the strong had a right to take from the weak, and that anyone who couldn't defend their resources didn't deserve to keep them. The ranch became a battleground as 3 separate forces converged in the pre-dawn darkness. The Hunters attacking from the north, a massive infected horde drawn by the sound of gunfire approaching from the east, and Sarah's group caught in the crossfire of a conflict that would determine not just their survival but the kind of world that would emerge from the ashes of the old one. Emma's knowledge of the terrain became crucial as she led small teams of survivors through hidden paths and natural cover, using her tracking skills to turn the hunters into the hunted, setting traps and ambushes that exploited their overconfidence and unfamiliarity with the local geography. Dr. Vasquez made a desperate decision to use the ranch's ham radio to broadcast her research findings to anyone who might be listening, hoping that her discovery about slowing the infection's progression might reach other scientists or medical professionals who could build upon her work. The radio transmission inadvertently revealed their location to both friends and enemies, drawing attention from survivor groups across the region who saw the ranch as either salvation or a target worth taking. The 3-way battle that erupted as dawn broke over the rolling hills was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in 20 years of military service, fighting infected creatures that retained tactical knowledge while simultaneously defending against human predators who had abandoned their humanity in favor of survival at any cost. Tom Bradley fell defending his home, his sacrifice buying precious time for the others to escape, while Emma made the heart-wrenching decision to burn the ranch rather than let it fall into the hunters' hands, ensuring that the medical supplies and research data wouldn't be used to further their twisted agenda. As the survivors fled into the wilderness once again, carrying Emma's grief and Dr. Vasquez's research toward an uncertain future, Sarah realized that their greatest enemy might not be the infected after all, but the darkness that emerged in ordinary people when civilization's restraints were stripped away, leaving them to face the terrible question of what they were willing to become in order to survive. The mountain radio station emerged from the storm-darkened sky like a beacon of forgotten hope, its transmission tower piercing the clouds that had been gathering for days, promising the kind of weather that could trap them on the peak for weeks. Commander Sarah Chun led the 43 remaining survivors up the winding access road, their numbers reduced by the brutal encounter with the hunters and the infected horde that had followed them for nearly 50 miles through the wilderness. 1 month had passed since the world ended, and each day had carved deeper lines into faces that had once known peace, transforming ordinary people into hardened survivors who moved with the quiet efficiency of those who had learned that noise meant death. Mike Voice Patterson, the station's lone operator, had been broadcasting automated distress signals and emergency information since the outbreak began, his voice becoming a lifeline for isolated survivors across the region, though he hadn't expected anyone to actually climb the treacherous mountain roads to reach his isolated outpost. The station's equipment represented a communication network that spanned hundreds of miles, connecting scattered survivor settlements, military holdouts, and civilian groups who had managed to establish temporary safe zones in the chaos of the New World. Emma Bradley's tracking skills had been essential in navigating the mountain paths while avoiding both infected and human threats, her grief over her father's death channeled into a fierce determination to protect what remained of their group, her knowledge of wilderness survival keeping them alive when supplies ran low and the weather turned hostile. Dr. Elena Vasquez had continued her research during their journey, analyzing samples and portable equipment that the Torres twins had jerry-rigged to run on car batteries, her discovery about slowing the infection's progression becoming more refined as she tested different combinations of readily available medications. The radio station's archives revealed a disturbing truth about the government's response to the outbreak. Internal communications showed that certain areas had been deliberately written off as expendable zones, their populations abandoned to contain the infection while resources were concentrated on protecting what officials deemed strategic assets. Mike Patterson's logs painted a picture of a nationwide network of survivor settlements, but also revealed the existence of something called Phoenix Protocol, a mysterious transmission that appeared on encrypted channels, claiming to have developed a cure but demanding proof of worthiness from any group seeking access to the treatment. The voice behind the Phoenix transmission spoke with the authority of someone who had intimate knowledge of the outbreak's origins, offering hope in exchange for completing seemingly impossible tasks that tested both the survivors' capabilities and their willingness to sacrifice their humanity for salvation. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice as she studied the communication logs: pursue the Phoenix Protocol and risk everything on the promise of a cure, or continue their journey toward the rumored safe zones that might not exist, carrying Dr. Vasquez's research that could help others but might never reach anyone who could implement it on a large scale. The mountain station became a crossroads of information and decision, with survivors from other groups beginning to arrive after hearing Mike's enhanced broadcasts, creating a temporary community of desperate people who shared resources and intelligence while planning their next moves. Among the newcomers was a family of 5 who had walked 300 miles from the ruins of Atlanta, their story of urban survival providing crucial insights into how the infection had spread and evolved in densely populated areas, confirming Dr. Vasquez's theories about the virus's multiple variants and adaptive capabilities. The storm that had been threatening for days finally arrived with unprecedented fury, trapping everyone at the station as hurricane-force winds and driving rain made travel impossible, while the lightning strikes interfered with radio transmissions and left them cut off from the outside world. Emma's weather sense proved invaluable as she helped prepare the station for the siege, her knowledge of mountain storms allowing them to secure equipment and supplies before the worst of the weather hit, but even her expertise couldn't predict how long they would be trapped or what would be waiting for them when the storm passed. The infected had been following their trail up the mountain, and the storm's arrival coincided with the appearance of a massive horde that surrounded the station, their movements coordinated by the mysterious intelligent variants that seemed to understand weather patterns and tactical advantages. Dr. Vasquez made a breakthrough discovery while analyzing intercepted Phoenix Protocol transmissions. The encrypted messages contained genetic sequences that matched her research, suggesting that whoever was behind Phoenix not only had access to advanced laboratory facilities but also possessed detailed knowledge of the virus's structure and potential weaknesses. Sarah realized that their isolated mountain refuge had become the center of a convergence that would determine the fate of everyone under her protection, with the storm trapping them between the advancing infected horde below and the mysterious Phoenix Protocol above, forcing her to make decisions that would either lead to humanity's salvation or its final destruction. While the radio crackled with desperate voices from across the wasteland, calling out into the static-filled darkness for anyone who might still be listening. The mountain radio station emerged from the storm-darkened sky like a beacon of forgotten hope, its transmission tower piercing the clouds that had been gathering for days, promising the kind of weather that could trap them on the peak for weeks. Commander Sarah Chun led the 43 remaining survivors up the winding access road, their numbers reduced by the brutal encounter with the hunters and the infected horde that had followed them for nearly 50 miles through the wilderness. 1 month had passed since the world ended, and each day had carved deeper lines into faces that had once known peace, transforming ordinary people into hardened survivors who moved with the quiet efficiency of those who had learned that noise meant death. Mike Voice Patterson, the station's lone operator, had been broadcasting automated distress signals and emergency information since the outbreak began, his voice becoming a lifeline for isolated survivors across the region, though he hadn't expected anyone to actually climb the treacherous mountain roads to reach his isolated outpost. The station's equipment represented a communication network that spanned hundreds of miles, connecting scattered survivor settlements, military holdouts, and civilian groups who had managed to establish temporary safe zones in the chaos of the New World. Emma Bradley's tracking skills had been essential in navigating the mountain paths while avoiding both infected and human threats. Her grief over her father's death channeled into a fierce determination to protect what remained of their group, her knowledge of wilderness survival keeping them alive when supplies ran low and the weather turned hostile. Dr. Elena Vasquez had continued her research during their journey, analyzing samples and portable equipment that the Torres twins had jerry-rigged to run on car batteries, her discovery about slowing the infection's progression becoming more refined as she tested different combinations of readily available medications. The radio station's archives revealed a disturbing truth about the government's response to the outbreak. Internal communications showed that certain areas had been deliberately written off as expendable zones, their populations abandoned to contain the infection while resources were concentrated on protecting what officials deemed strategic assets. Mike Patterson's logs painted a picture of a nationwide network of survivor settlements, but also revealed the existence of something called Phoenix Protocol, a mysterious transmission that appeared on encrypted channels, claiming to have developed a cure but demanding proof of worthiness from any group seeking access to the treatment. The voice behind the Phoenix transmission spoke with the authority of someone who had intimate knowledge of the outbreak's origins, offering hope in exchange for completing seemingly impossible tasks that tested both the survivors' capabilities and their willingness to sacrifice their humanity for salvation. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice as she studied the communication logs: pursue the Phoenix Protocol and risk everything on the promise of a cure, or continue their journey toward the rumored safe zones that might not exist, carrying Dr. Vasquez's research that could help others but might never reach anyone who could implement it on a large scale. The mountain station became a crossroads of information and decision, with survivors from other groups beginning to arrive after hearing Mike's enhanced broadcasts, creating a temporary community of desperate people who shared resources and intelligence while planning their next moves. Among the newcomers was a family of 5 who had walked 300 miles from the ruins of Atlanta, their story of urban survival providing crucial insights into how the infection had spread and evolved in densely populated areas, confirming Dr. Vasquez's theories about the virus's multiple variants and adaptive capabilities. The storm that had been threatening for days finally arrived with unprecedented fury, trapping everyone at the station as hurricane-force winds and driving rain made travel impossible, while the lightning strikes interfered with radio transmissions and left them cut off from the outside world. Emma's weather sense proved invaluable as she helped prepare the station for the siege, her knowledge of mountain storms allowing them to secure equipment and supplies before the worst of the weather hit, but even her expertise couldn't predict how long they would be trapped or what would be waiting for them when the storm passed. The infected had been following their trail up the mountain, and the storm's arrival coincided with the appearance of a massive horde that surrounded the station, their movements coordinated by the mysterious intelligent variants that seemed to understand weather patterns and tactical advantages. Dr. Vasquez made a breakthrough discovery while analyzing intercepted Phoenix Protocol transmissions. The encrypted messages contained genetic sequences that matched her research, suggesting that whoever was behind Phoenix not only had access to advanced laboratory facilities but also possessed detailed knowledge of the virus's structure and potential weaknesses. Sarah realized that their isolated mountain refuge had become the center of a convergence that would determine the fate of everyone under her protection, with the storm trapping them between the advancing infected horde below and the mysterious Phoenix Protocol above, forcing her to make decisions that would either lead to humanity's salvation or its final destruction. While the radio crackled with desperate voices from across the wasteland, calling out into the static-filled darkness for anyone who might still be listening. The coastal evacuation point stretched along the rocky shore like humanity's final prayer, its makeshift landing strips and medical tents representing the last coordinated effort of international forces to establish a foothold in what had once been the United States of America. Commander Sarah Chin stood at the cliff's edge, watching transport ships emerge from the morning mist, 2 months after the world had ended and 6 days after their escape from Dr. Wright's facility with stolen research data that might save what remained of civilization. Only 29 survivors had made it to the coast, their numbers reduced by the desperate running battle that had carried them across 200 miles of infected wasteland, each mile paid for with blood and sacrifice as Wright's controlled hordes pursued them with relentless determination. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked frantically in the evacuation zone's medical facility, collaborating with international researchers who had arrived from uninfected regions, her stolen data combining with resources from around the world to create the first truly effective treatment protocol that could halt the infection's progression in most cases. The cure proved to be everything Wright had claimed and more: partially effective, requiring complex administration procedures, and creating a new category of human existence as those who had been infected but treated retained physical and mental changes that marked them as different from both the living and the dead. Emma Bradley had become something more than a tracker during their final journey, her intimate knowledge of the infected's behavior patterns making her invaluable to the international teams who were mapping safe corridors and establishing quarantine protocols for the massive cleanup operation that would define the next decade. Jake Morrison's knowledge of government protocols and hidden facilities proved crucial as international forces worked to locate and secure remaining research data, weapons stockpiles, and survivor settlements scattered across the continent, his expertise helping coordinate the largest humanitarian operation in human history. The evacuation zone had become a microcosm of the world's future, with survivors from across the region arriving daily, bringing stories of isolated communities that had found ways to coexist with low-level infected populations, creating a new understanding of what survival might look like in a world permanently changed by Wright's virus. Maria Santos and the Torres twins had established themselves as essential members of the Reconstruction Planning Committee, their practical skills and knowledge of survivor needs helping design protocols for the massive refugee camps that would house millions of displaced people while the world figured out how to rebuild. The children who had survived the journey, David and Lisa Chen among them, represented hope for a generation that would grow up knowing both the worst and best of human nature, their resilience and adaptability suggesting that humanity might emerge stronger from its darkest hour. Dr. Wright's facility had been destroyed in a coordinated international strike, but his research continued to yield insights that helped medical teams understand and treat the various viral strains, turning his weapon of mass destruction into a tool for healing, though the moral implications of using his knowledge would haunt the scientific community for generations. The International Safe Zone operated under strict protocols that balanced security with humanitarian needs, creating a new model of governance that prioritized collective survival while preserving individual dignity, a delicate balance that would be tested as more survivors arrived and resources stretched thin. Catherine Moore had been captured during their escape and was providing crucial intelligence about other hidden facilities and research programs, her cooperation earning her a chance at redemption while helping authorities locate and neutralize remaining biological threats scattered across the continent. The infected populations that remained showed signs of stabilization rather than continued aggression, with some groups establishing territorial behaviors that suggested the possibility of long-term coexistence, though constant monitoring and careful management would be required to prevent future outbreaks. Sarah's final report to the International Command detailed not just the tactical aspects of their survival but the human lessons learned during 2 months of hell, that leadership meant making impossible choices, that hope could survive the darkest circumstances, and that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its technology but in its willingness to sacrifice for others. The new world that emerged from the ashes would be fundamentally different from what had come before, marked by international cooperation born from shared trauma, scientific advances driven by desperate necessity, and social structures that prioritized community survival over individual gain. As Sarah watched the last transport ship disappear over the horizon, carrying survivors toward uncertain but hopeful futures in uninfected regions, she understood that their journey had been more than just survival. It had been proof that humanity could endure its worst impulses and emerge with its core values intact. The dawn breaking over the evacuation zone illuminated not just the end of their nightmare but the beginning of humanity's long journey back from the brink, a journey that would require everything they had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that connected people even in the darkest times, as they worked together to build a world where Wright's vision of genetic superiority would be replaced by a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be human.